Hi folks, I'm Mike and I hope you're well. I'm afraid I have to start off with an apology for that rather clickbaity thumbnail and title, because let's face it, the limiter in Studio One is far from sexy, but there is good intention behind my deceit for a couple of reasons really. Firstly, I'd hate for you to overlook this plugin because it seems rather drab and boring to you, and secondly, you may have already been using this plugin but misunderstood the controls in it. I'd love to clear that up for you now, but before I do, let's just take a quick look at the differences between a compressor and a limiter. Both compressors and limiters are designed to affect the level of our signal, or the volume if you like, and in fact they both start off at least by turning it down. Now the point at which we do that is determined by something called the threshold, and you can see here on the compressor that the threshold is currently set to -20 dB, and what we're saying here is, hey, once the signal reaches and goes over -20 dB, start to turn things down. Now how much we turn it down by is determined by the ratio, and you can see me adjusting that here. But it's important to understand that the signal is still allowed to go over -20 dB. It's just not as loud as it would have been if we hadn't used the compressor. That's a little bit different to a limiter. With a limiter, what we're saying is, hey, once it reaches that level that we're going to set, don't let it go over it at all. Now there are cases where they can both sound a little bit similar. If, for example, on the compressor I was to push the ratio up to its highest value, I'd hardly be allowing the signal to go over -20 dB at all, and it will sound quite a lot like a limiter at that point. So there are cases where you could use either or of these plugins. So for example, with vocal serial compression, which I often use, I'll have one compressor right after the other, and the first compressor is just in charge of reducing the sudden transients and peaks of that vocal. But I could use a limiter for that role as well. It's just up to you to determine which is working best in your mix at that time. Now that's one case for a limiter, but for most people the place where they're going to be using it, I think with Studio One, is in the master bus, and this is where we're just going to try and make our overall the overall loudness of our mix sound louder. Now I wouldn't use this as a replacement for mastering at all, but it can be useful if you're sending out demo mixes and you just want to get everything up to a reasonable volume, or perhaps even while you're mixing and you just want to listen to it at a particular volume. Okay, so for the rest of this tutorial I will be using it in that position with one of my mixes. Now to add to the confusion a little bit before we go further, I do want to point out that the threshold control in Studio One's compressor behaves a little differently to the threshold control in the limiter, and some of you may have assumed it's the same, so let's clear up that confusion. So before we do look at that threshold control, I'd like to take a look at probably the most important control on this plugin, and that is the ceiling control. This is the point where we actually say don't go over this ceiling, don't get any louder than this. Now when this plugin is on a master bus like this, I normally set this to -1 dB. Why not just leave it at 0? Well, later on when this is converted by another system or another plugin, there is potential that we could allow the signal to go slightly over the ceiling during conversion. So I'm basically putting in -1 to allow a little bit of wiggle room there. Okay, now let's have a quick listen to the chorus of this song and see where our signal is actually getting to by looking at the metering up here.
And I guess Superman never really ever gave a damn about love.
Now you can see it's only really getting to, say, somewhere between -6 and -3 dB. So it's not even reaching our ceiling, so no limiting is occurring just yet. By the way, that's pretty typical of where the peaks will be for one of my mixers. So what I'm going to do now is make it louder just by using the gain control. Now this gain control, importantly, is not an output gain control, so it's not a makeup gain that we see sometimes on a compressor. It's an input gain, so we're just putting more signal into the plugin, therefore it's going to get louder. However, we're not going to allow anything to go over -1 dB. Let's see how far we can go.
And I guess Superman never really ever gave a damn about Lois Lane, the Daily Planet on the...
So it's quite a lot louder, but you may have seen there was a little bit of gain reduction happening, okay, around about sort of -1 to -3 at times. So that's a quick and dirty way to make your mix sound louder without actually clipping. So you may be thinking, well, what is this threshold control for then? Well, the threshold control, first of all, is relative to the ceiling. It's not an absolute control. So if I set this to -5, for example, I'm not setting it to -5 dB. It's relative to the ceiling. The ceiling's at -1. This is -5. So its true setting for the threshold at the moment is actually -6. So you would think, wouldn't you, that if I start to play this track now, nothing will go over -6 dB. Well, let's test that theory.
And I guess Superman never really...
Obviously, it's going well over -6. So what is going on here? Well, it's important to understand that the threshold control is adjusting it to -6, but it also has makeup gain attached to it. So automatic makeup gain is being used to make up for that low threshold, which is now happening there. So in effect, it's making it sound even louder than it was before. So in my opinion, you could use just the gain control by itself and just leave the threshold where it is, or use a combination of the two to get really sort of super loud mixes if you like. Now, I didn't think that was sounding particularly pleasant there because I could really hear the limiting happening, and that's not something I would want on a song like this. But yeah, you need to adjust that to your own likes. Now, there are cases where some noise can occur, okay, when you really sort of push it like this. And if that happens, you may want to take a look at this mode button here. With mode A, we do get clean limiting, okay, but the limiter responds a little bit more slowly than if we switched it to mode B. Now with mode B, the limiter is reacting faster, but there is a chance of some distortion. So do keep that in mind. Now the other things which may affect noise and the sound of the limiting here are in the envelope. So the first thing we see in the envelope section is the attack control, which can be set to fast, normal, or slow. Now I don't know what the exact values of these settings are. It's not in the documentation, and you'll need to experiment anyway with your piece of music. But just be aware that if you have it set to slow, then the limiter may not react fast enough to some really sudden peaks or transients, okay? Now, on the other hand, if you set this to fast, then you may end up sort of squashing all of your transients, and that may not be what you want either. So you do have to experiment with your piece of music, and it also depends on what effect you want to get. Now, next to this is the release control. Now, this can be set between 1 millisecond all the way up to 3 seconds. I'm going to start off by setting it, say, to, I don't know, somewhere around 500 milliseconds. And to demonstrate what's going to happen here, I've used some really silly settings over here in the input section. I've set the ceiling down to -5. I've pushed the gain all the way up. So this is not going to sound great, okay? But have a listen to what is actually happening.
And I guess Superman never really ever gave a damn about Lois Lane.
You get that kind of almost a pumping effect, they call it, but you can actually hear the limiter sort of engaging and disengaging there, yeah? And it's usually not what you want as an effect. So the solution to that is to turn the release down, okay? Now, the only problem with this is, as the smaller we get this release, or the shorter we get this release, the more likelihood there is of some distortion, okay? Let's have a quick listen.
And I guess Superman never really.
So, you know, it still doesn't sound great because of these other settings, but you can hear just a little bit of distortion in there, okay? Now, it's probably going to be okay, you know, just at a lowish setting like so, maybe, you know, 3 or 4 milliseconds or what have you, especially if I have this ceiling set to something sensible, like -1, for example. I'll just turn the gain down a little bit, have a listen now.
And I guess Superman never really ever gave a damn about Lois Lane.
Okay, so we've definitely got rid of that kind of pumping effect there with the release control. Okay, so I probably don't want to get out of my depth or beyond my full understanding here. So I'm just going to talk about the effects of something called true peak and soft clipping here. You can see that true peak is switched on here at the moment. I normally do have that switched on. Now, this is to account for the fact that with any one sample which represents the peak, it may not be the true peak of the output, because there's something called intersample peaks which can occur, and they may go over the ceiling that we've set here, okay? So having true peak on sort of counteracts that happening and make sure that we do stay below our ceiling, okay? If we click on this, it switches off, and then soft clipping is turned on, okay? Now, soft clipping is a way of handling clipping, and I guess the result of it is that things sound a bit smoother, a little bit more analog, if you like. So it smooths off the clipping. It actually does add some harmonics as well, and you're going to probably feel that this is a little bit more pleasant form of clipping. We can actually switch that or click that again, and that switches both of them off. Now, while we're looking at the top half of this plugin, it's worth looking at the options in terms of metering. I have it selected to peak RMS metering at the moment. So the bars are going to go up to the peak, and that's where the fastest movement is there. And then the red lines represent the RMS, the kind of average level, if you like. That's a pretty decent indicator of loudness or perceived loudness, if you like. But it's worth pointing out that apart from this peak RMS metering, we also have 3 other types of metering: K20, K14 and K12. So this is K system metering, and these are the 3 meters that are usually used within that system. Now, it's sort of well beyond the scope of this tutorial to explain the differences between these metering types, but I do think that they're worth investigating. Or if you would like me to make a video about K system metering, then do let me know in the comments down below. So at the beginning of this video, we quickly talked about the compressor that comes with Studio One. I recommend you watch this video right here if you really want to find out about that plugin in depth. You'll be glad you did. I promise. Go on.